Well, good morning, everyone. We are now going to be starting Hebrews chapter 10, believe it or not. We are actually making some progress through this letter. Now, if you remember from 2 weeks ago, at the end of chapter 9, I had mentioned that the author of Hebrews was kind of reviewing and repeating some of his prior points, although sometimes with a little different nuance. And as he gets towards the end of the letter, he's going to do that some more. Some of what we're going to talk about in chapter 10, some of these comparisons that we're going to talk about are going to be familiar to us because they are territory that he's gone over before. He repeats these things because he's trying to hammer these truths into his readers and how important these truths are. But one of the things that I'm noticing is that each time he brings up one of these ideas, even if it's something that he's covered before, he usually adds a new little nuance to it, a new shade of meaning, adds perhaps a new metaphor or analogy to it to help us understand it a little bit more. And that's kind of what he's going to do as we go into chapter 10, because the essence of it, especially the first part of it, are sort of the limits of the Old Testament law. Well, of course, we've been talking about the limits of the Old Testament law for several chapters. But he adds some other nuances in this chapter. So some of this will be familiar, but some of it, of course, will be new. So what we're going to talk about today in the first 5 verses of Hebrews is we're going to talk about a shadow. And this is a metaphor he's bringing up to compare the law to the work of Christ. And he's used this metaphor before, but he expounds on it, I think, a little bit in these verses. So in the first verse of chapter 5, what he's going to talk about now is sort of the nature of the law. Now, once again, he's talked about the nature of the law before, but he gives it this new little shade of meaning. Verse 1 says, "The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves." So, the law, he says, is only a shadow. The Greek word there, skia, it means the image or the outline of an object that is caused by an interception of light. Now, if you think about a shadow, I think that's a really interesting metaphor when you think about what a shadow is and what it isn't. A shadow is actually not a thing. A shadow is actually the absence of something. The shadow itself is nothing. It's the absence of light caused by the interception of an object, between the source and whatever the shadow is on. It's not an object that can do anything on its own. A shadow can't actually do anything. Now, we can say that the shadow kind of has the overall shape and appearance of the thing that causes the shadow, but it's not precise, and it can kind of be manipulated or even misinterpreted. I think about, when I think about this, imagine thinking about the metaphor of the shadow, thinking about shadow puppets. I mean, when you were a kid, didn't we all do the little, I can't do them, I was never good at them, but I'm sure some of y'all were good at shadow puppets. Yeah. So you make these shadow puppets on the wall so that it looked like something, and it had the overall sort of shape of it, but it's not really what it is, because really what's making the shadow is something totally different. And it can be manipulated, sometimes even to be something that is even scary. Think of how many horror movies you've seen, where there was this menacing shadow that turned out to be nothing. What came to my mind when I was thinking about this is that scene in The Return of the King. You remember that scene where Sam is coming up the stairs in the tower where Frodo is being held, and there's that big shadow of him on the wall. He's going, "Arr!" And all the orcs run away because the shadow looks really big. until he comes around the corner and it's just little Sam, and they're like, oh, is that all? It's just a dorky little hobbit, But when he was coming up the stairs, the shadow was big, Shadows can be manipulated and they can look like something, but one thing, but then be something else. Another thing that I remember, just as an analogy, huh?
I thought about Peter Pan's shadow. It had to be sewed back onto it.
Oh, I guess I forgot about that. It's been so long since I've seen that. Yeah. But I don't know if you remember that Star Trek The Next Generation episode where Geordi turns into that creature that's invisible.
Yes, I do remember that.
There's one particular scene that always creeped me out in that episode, and I won't go through the whole description, but it is relevant here. I'll just give you the Reader's Digest condensed version. Basically, the Enterprise goes to this planet where there was a survey team that had gone there before that they all disappeared, and they couldn't figure out where they went. So the Enterprise goes to investigate, and they go down the planet where there's the shuttle, and they find the shuttle in front of this building, but all the people are gone, and they don't know what happened to them. And so they find some log entries, and so Geordi, the engineer, he's back on the Enterprise, and he's got these visual logs, and he's looking over them trying to figure out if he can get a clue off of these visual logs of what happened. So he decides to take this into the holodeck and have a three-dimensional representation of the logs, so he can just kind of walk through it, and maybe he can pick up some clues. And this one particular scene is he just notices, because there's a guy that has like this headset on that has a light because it's at night, and it's a real bright light, and it's creating shadows on the wall of the building that they're next to. And as the crew in the logs are walking past, he's seeing these shadows, and he just keeps looking funny, and he realizes there's this weird shadow. So he'll say, computer, take this person out, and then that person will disappear from the video. And then he'll say, okay, now take this person out, and that person will... He finally got the computer to take the images of everybody out. But there was still this just weird shadow on the wall, and it was just this... And he said, computer, show me a representation of what could be causing this shadow. And the computer creates this real weird, lumpy looking thing that just looks like I don't know, it's just something the computer created that would cause that shadow. And of course it's one of those invisible creatures, is what's causing it, is an invisible creature that's creating the shadow. But it was always a creepy scene because the computer was trying to create a representation of an object that would cause the shadow, because it was just a shape is all it was. And so the point I'm trying to make, thinking about what a shadow is a shadow can give you the overall shape of something, but it can be misleading because it can be manipulated by how close the light source is. It can make it look bigger than it really is. Thinking about the shadow puppets, it can even be manipulated to do something to appear in a different way than it really is.
It makes me think of back when we used to use a projector, and on the slightest occasion, if you remember, a spider would be on the projector. And
oh yeah, I forgot. You mean the overhead projector? We did the overhead projector. Yeah. Remember that's right, the spider, because it had been down in the... There was this little spider that walked across the top of the overhead, but it was a huge spider. And Elaine was like, oh! I forgot about that. That's a good example too. So, why did I talk all this thing about the shadow? Because he says the author here says the law is only a shadow. So that means that because it's a shadow, it's not the thing itself. It's only a representation of it. It can give us a rough idea of the shape of what it's a shadow of, but it is not precise. And because it's only a shadow, in and itself can't actually do anything. The shadow is powerless. The shadow can't do anything on its own. It can only, something has to come along to fill in the shadow to replace it in order for it to do anything. So the law is only a shadow. Well, what's in the shadow of? Because that's what we're saying. A shadow is a shape of something that's intercepting the light. So what is it a shadow of? Well, he says the law is a shadow of the good things that are coming. Now, I'm pointing out this word again. We've used this word many times because the author of Hebrews uses it a lot. It's the word agathos. And it means good, but it is the nuance of this Greek word is something that is actually beneficial. Not just that it's good, but that because it's good, it's beneficial. You know, thinking about like vitamins are good because they're good for you. You know, that it's beneficial to you. Not good because it just looks nice, good because it provides a benefit. So the law is a shadow of something good that is actually beneficial to us. So if something's beneficial, then unlike a shadow, it can actually accomplish something. So the law is a shadow that can't do anything on its own, but what it's a shadow of is something good that can provide a benefit to us. It can actually accomplish what needs to accomplish. So this coming agathos can do what the shadow cannot. So it's a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. The word realities there is the word icon. And yes, it is where we get our English word icon, I-C-O-N. It means a likeness or a resemblance. So this word also can imply a representation of something. But the way it normally is used, especially in this particular contrast, where he's contrasting skia, shadow, with icon, likeness, is that he's contrasting it in that that icon is a more exact representation or a more exact image than a mere shadow. Jesus uses this same word icon in Matthew 22:20 to describe the portrait of Caesar that's on the coin used to pay the tax. Remember, Jesus says, you know, they asked him, is it lawful to pay for the Jews to pay tax to Caesar? And he said, give me a coin used to pay the tax. And he said, whose image is on this coin? And they said, Caesar. And he says, well, then give Caesar what is Caesar's. Well, the word he uses is icon for the image of Caesar. And that means it's an exact representation. It was a portrait of Caesar. So a common analogy and a common way that it was used in Koine or Common Greek is the idea of a statue. A statue is an icon. And so imagine the contrast then, for example, between a statue and the shadow of a statue. That's the contrast that the author of Hebrews here is making. Is icon is an exact representation of something, whereas the shadow is just an amorphous blob of shadow, you know. And again, think about a statue and then the shadow of a statue. The statue really shows you what you need, an exact representation. So he's telling us then that this difference between the law and what is coming that's beneficial. So he goes on to tell us this is the reason for something. The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship. So this view of the law as only being the shadow of something is the reason or the explanation for its weakness and its limitations. So what is it that the law can't do? Because it's only a shadow, what is it unable to do? He says it can never, first of all, it says it can never do something. The word there, never, means not at any time, never at all. In other words, this is a very absolute statement. In other words, it's not rarely or only sometimes or most of the time or whatever. It means not even one time. It is powerless. Because it's a shadow, there is never a time under any circumstances that you could ever imagine that it might do what its adherents want it to do. It is utterly, completely, in all cases, powerless. And I think that's one of the reasons why he uses the metaphor of a shadow. Because if you think about a shadow of something, A shadow can never do anything, ever. There's not one case where you think a shadow can actually accomplish whatever it is that the shadow it is of could do. It's utterly powerless. So then he talks about these same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year. So what this phrase is talking about is emphasizing this contrast between the effort to continually go through the motions of the sacrifices, the animal sacrifices, year after year without end, and the result, which is nothing. So in other words, you've got these endless sacrifices going year after year that are the law, part of the law. And what is the result? Nothing. No matter how many years, no matter how many sacrifices, there's never a time that it will work. There's never a time when those sacrifices will work. Will work in what? What's the purpose? What is it that they were trying to accomplish? And that is to make perfect those who draw near to worship. So this is what the shadow cannot do. It cannot complete the work of redemption, atonement, forgiveness. It can't make perfect or complete the work of redemption. Because year after year, sacrifice after sacrifice, blood after blood, continually, it can't accomplish it. Not one single time has it ever accomplished it. So that's the nature of the law. Now verse 2 is an interesting verse. Verse 2 is talking about what the potential of the law could be if it worked. Basically what this whole verse is it's a hypothetical. It's an if statement. He's already telling you the law can't do it. But what he's doing is he's trying to imagine a world if it could. If it could, what would be the result? Verse 2, if it could, that is accomplish, making perfect the worshipers, if it could, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshipers would have been cleansed once for all and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. So, if that could have worked, if what was promised in the law could have made the worshipers perfect, what would be the result? What was the potential of the law if it had been able to work? Well, the result would have been that the sacrifices would have stopped. Would they not have stopped being offered? The sacrifices? The word there, pao, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, I'm probably not, means to pause. It's where we get our English word pause. It means to quit, desist, or come to an end. So remember 2 weeks ago we were talking about the real thing, If the law were the real thing, the offerings of the blood of the bulls and the goats would have stopped. Why would they have stopped? Because if they had worked, they wouldn't have been needed anymore. They would have come to a stop. But obviously, at the time of the writing of Hebrews, the offerings had not stopped. They were continuing. They were still going. The offerings in the temple were continuing. Now this question is a rhetorical question because we know the answer is yes, they would have, but they haven't. That's what he's asking his readers. He's saying, look, if you want to go back to the law, if you want to trust in the law, if you want to trust in these sacrifices, if they really would accomplish what you were wanting them to accomplish, wouldn't they have stopped? But did they stop? Well, of course not. They're still going. So that must mean they're not working because we're still doing it. Now, as a historical note, this is a little sidebar, this gives us some idea of the time of the writing of Hebrews. Because we know that the sacrifices actually did stop, not because they worked, but because in 70 AD was when the Roman army sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. And the sacrifices stopped at that point because the temple was destroyed. The fact that these were still going at the time this was being written means that it had to have been written before 70 AD. So that gives us the outside historical time when these could have been written. Because if the temple had already been destroyed at the time this was written, he would have no doubt made that comment or made this comment somehow differently. But because he says they're still going, that means it was before 70 AD and the sacrifices were still going on. The reason that they would have stopped is not because the temple was destroyed. The reason that they would have stopped was because the worshipers would have been cleansed, he said. That was the great promise of the law, the purging of the guilt and the penalty of sin. If the law had worked, then the ones who participate in it would be declared righteous by now. They would have been justified by now. They would have been cleansed once for all. Here we have that phrase again. We've talked about this phrase before because he's used this a number of times. It means a single time. One time only. If the promise of the law would have worked, then they would have had to only do it one time. And that would have been it. Pack up the tabernacle, put it in the attic. We don't need it anymore. One time, it's all we needed. But that's not what happened. It kept happening over and over and over, year after year after year. And the result would have been, he says, they would have no longer have felt guilty for their sins. And this has to do with that moral conscience. And the root of that word there means to see clearly. So the idea is that they would have been able to look in their own hearts and recognize right from wrong, make that decision, and make the right decision. If the law had worked, then the ones who participated could look clearly into their own hearts and know that they were free from guilt. But yet that's not what happened. So that's the potential of the law, or I should say what the law promised, if it had worked. But I'm sure you know, especially if you know anything about computer programming, if there's an if statement in a computer program, then there's always the, well, if but, or if then. There's always, an if is always a supposition of what would happen if the answer is yes. But if the answer is no, then what's the result? Well, that's the next part. The result is the but. Verse 3. He says, if it could, would they not have stopped being offered? But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sin. So we know that the answer to that hypothetical in verse 2 was no. That we know the answer is no. So what is the actual result? Verse 2 is the potential result. Verse 3 is the real result. He says those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sin. The sacrifices didn't stop. They kept going on year after year. And rather than enabling the worshipers to forget their sin, instead, they kept bringing the sin to mind endlessly. They were a continual reminder of this existence, penalty, and the effect of continued sin. And if you think about this for a moment, I think a lot of times when we talk about in theological terms and historical terms, we talk about these sacrifices in these sort of theological and historical terms. We kind of tend to sanitize them. But the reality of what went on in the tabernacle with those animal sacrifices is actually a very bloody, grim thing. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the movie Apocalypse Now. You ever seen that movie? I had not seen it till recently. It was not a movie I was all that interested in, to tell you the truth, but it's one of those movies that they say if you're a fan of war movies and all, it's one of those movies like Saving Private Ryan you really should see. Well, it came up on my recommendations recently in Amazon Prime, and I decided to watch it because I had never seen it before. Well, if you've never seen it, you probably don't realize this, but at one point later late in the movie, there is actually a scene where one of the indigenous villages of indigenous tribes there in Vietnam actually sacrificed a cow. And I actually read about that, and that was not like a special effect or something. It was something that was not even in the script. It was actually something that the people living in that village actually really did. And Francis Ford Coppola, I think he was the director, he actually filmed it, and it was real. It was not a special effect or something. It was a real slaughter of a cow. And he filmed it and put it in that movie. And I didn't know that going into it. It is because I'd never seen the movie before. And I've never seen anything like that in real life before. I mean, I've read about it, but I've never seen that before. And it was, even for me, who's used to seeing bloody, gory movies, especially when I realized it really happened, that was very disturbing. When you think about slitting a live animal's throat, the amount of blood that comes out of that, and it's not like, you know, euthanizing an animal in a vet, where they just go to sleep. I mean, that animal screams and cries and wails while it's being killed. I mean, I'm not trying to be morbid or anything to you guys, but my point is that when these animal sacrifices happened in the tabernacle, it was a grim, bloody, horrid thing to witness. These goats and things, as they were live when they were having their throats cut, and animals scream when they're being killed, and blood spurts everywhere. I mean, it was bloody and grim and horrible, and this was something that the people witnessed constantly, year after year. And what it was a reminder of was a couple of things. It was a reminder of the seriousness of sin, and it was a reminder of God's hatred for sin and the consequences for sin. But it was also a reminder, a continual reminder, that this didn't work. Because if it had happened once and then they didn't have to do it again, that would have been one thing. But every single year it had to keep happening over and over and over. Year after year, the people had to watch that bloody, grim spectacle of the animals being sacrificed. And so it was this grim reminder of how much a failure the law really was, because it didn't work. These sacrifices are an annual reminder of sin. He goes on to say, because it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to accomplish what they had to accomplish. This is the explanation for this but, which answered the if of verse 2. The law, the sacrifices, simply lack the ability and the power to work. To use another metaphor, they're like a dead battery with a dead cell trying to start a car. No matter how many times you turn that key or push that button, it ain't going to turn it over. It ain't going to start the car. Even if I know it's so frustrating when you have a dead battery and you just keep doing it. You just keep doing it. You just keep.
Put on the throttle at the same time, thinking if I give it some gas.
Yeah, give it some gas. Okay, after the 35th time I've turned that key. Okay, do I think it's going to work this time? No, I don't think so. And just think about the hundreds of years that had passed between the establishment of the sacrifices and this letter being written. How many times they turned that crank and the dead battery still won't start that car. So the thing that didn't work is the blood of those bulls and the goats. We talked about this before. The high priest could not enter the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, without blood. Remember we said it was the cost of admission to the most holy place was blood. He could not enter without blood. But that blood was counterfeit currency. It looks like what is needed because it's blood, but it's not the right blood. It doesn't work. It's only a shadow. It has the appearance of it, but it's not the real thing. So what was it powerless to do? It was powerless to take away sins. This, you see, is the potential of the law, what it represents itself as doing, taking away sins. But rather than banish sins away, all it does is serves to remind of the continued existence of sin. Because it kept happening over and over. In the first part of verse 5, of course, he once again introduces the answer. Therefore, Christ came into the world. So the coming of Christ is the coming of the light which dispels the shadow. You know, I said before, a shadow is nothing in itself. But when the light comes, what happens to the shadow? The shadow vanishes. Because the shadow itself is nothing. The shadow is just the absence of light. So when the light comes, the shadow disappears, and then you have the real thing. So when Christ came into the world, that was the entrance of light into the world. That was the entrance of the real thing, not just the shadow. That was the entrance of the thing that will work, as opposed to the blood of bulls and goats. Now this is just bonus content here. This is echoing what Paul said in Colossians 2:17. He used the same words. These, and when he talked about these, going back to just a quick context of Colossians 2, he was talking about, in Colossians 2, Paul was talking about, he was trying to encourage his readers who were being judged by people who were saying, you don't keep the Sabbath, you don't keep the religious festivals, so you're not as spiritual as we are. And Paul was saying, don't let those people who are embracing the law judge you. Because those things, the rituals that he's talking about, are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. Paul uses those same two words, skia and icon. He says those religious festivals that the legalists place so much importance on, those are the shadow of what was to come. The reality, though, is the icon is Christ. Okay, the regulations, those who embrace the regulations of the law look down on those who believe they were free in Christ. Because Paul was trying to tell them, you are free in Christ. You don't have to, you are free from the requirements of the law in Christ. So he was trying to tell his readers, don't let the legalists judge you because they were adhering to shadows and not the real thing. So I just think it's interesting that Paul uses the very same metaphor, which goes back to one of those things where, as we said, in the very beginning,
He's referencing his own work.
He's referencing his own work, perhaps, because he's using these same words. I think that's another textual evidence that perhaps Paul was actually the writer of Hebrews, although, again, we can't know for sure. But when he uses the same words and the same phrase and the same metaphor, I think there's a good possibility that that means it's the same writer. It's not proof, but it's evidence. So, the shadows versus the realities. The absence of light versus the actual light. The annual reminder, the bloody reminder that it's not working because it keeps happening year after year, versus one time for all. What Jesus did only had to be done once. He didn't have to go to the cross every year. He only went one time because his blood was the reality, not the shadow. So, that's where we're going to leave off today.